Hi, everyone. Nice to see everyone. Friends, welcome. My name is John Cardini. I'm Director of the Institute for Church Life here at the University of Notre Dame. I'd like, before I begin, to recognize the presence of two of our advisory council members of the Institute for Church Life Center for Social Concerns Advisory Council. That's Bob and Kathy Snyder. Friends, Saturday is the ancient Sabbath and was always, by Jewish and Christian interpreters of the Bible, thought of, because it was the seventh day, the day on which God rested, thought of the Sabbath as an image of eternity. And so, in a sense, our lecture series, Saturdays with the Saints, is also a little bit of an image of eternity, because we will be spending Saturday, the eternal Sabbath, the eternal Saturday, with the saints. So, not too many lecture series can claim that. But it is a contemplative moment set aside on a football weekend, therefore, to think about the saints who are, as Pope Benedict said, bearers of light in a world, which is sometimes seems to be filled with darkness, as I think our talk last time showed Franz Jagerstatter as a kind of bearer of light, and I think we'll see also today the four Churchwomen play that same role in a world which can seem to be dark. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Margie Pfeil this morning, a member of the Faculty of Theology here at the University of Notre Dame, where she also enjoys a joint appointment in the Center for Social Concerns, our sister institute, resident in this building. She's also a faculty fellow of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Margie teaches and writes in the areas of moral theology and Catholic and Christian ethics, with an emphasis on Catholic social teaching, peace studies, spirituality and social ethics, racial justice, ecological ethics. And her work in these areas has indeed been prodigious. Most recently, she has published 3 collections of essays: The Scandal of White Complicity in United States Psychic Incarceration, 2013, and Sharing Peace, Mennonites and Catholics in Conversation, 2012, as well as Violence, Transformation, and the Sacred, They Shall Be Called Children of God, also 2012. Her recent publications in journals are fully reflective of these interests and of the sometimes jarring juxtapositions that occur when you think about spirituality in conjunction with some of the scandals and systemic evils of our time. For example, terrible luminosity, social sin, systemic reconciliation, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the Annual of the Society of Christian Ethics in 2012. Or, directly relevant to the context of today's talk, Romero's Theology of Transfiguration in Theological Studies in 2011. There are many more such essays, but since it's Saturday morning, I won't mention them. But these provide a kind of representative account. Origen of Alexandria of old distinguished the literal or the bodily sense of Scripture from the spiritual sense of Scripture, emphasizing their integration as a kind of incarnation of the word in the letter. I think that Margie's articles and books are a little like the letter of the text, for they actively incarnate in words the spiritual energy and witness that Margie brings to so many other aspects of her life and work. Margie's teaching on the topics mentioned at every level of instruction at the university, from freshman year of studies to PhD, and in popular talks at schools and parishes, have made her one of Notre Dame's most beloved teachers and most sought-after speakers. As co-founder and resident of the St. Peter Claver Catholic Worker Community in South Bend, as well as of their apostolate, Our Lady of the Road, she provides us with another letter with the same spiritual meaning. For isn't it the point that the Spirit is not understood if it remains abstract, but only if it is incarnate in the world? Isn't that the meaning of the saints, and therefore the significance of our Saturday mornings with the saints? Margie will speak to us this morning In keeping with our series emphasis on the 20th century martyrs on the topic, 4 women martyrs of El Salvador: Ita Ford, Dorothy Kazel, Jean Donovan, and Maura Clark. I'm sure you'll all join me in welcoming Professor Margie Pfeil to the podium of Saturday's witnessing.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John. Thanks for all your support and your own witness over the years. And I'd like to acknowledge also members of my Catholic worker community who are here today. I see Leah and many others in the room who are supportive of the worker. Thank you. I just would like to say it's a tremendous honor for me to share with you a little bit about the lives of these women. They have been deeply formative for me personally, and just overhearing snippets of conversations as people entered the room, I think people who are present here have some connection to these women. So they are with us in spirit, as well as all the people to whom they ministered. And I would just like us to remember them in that way as we begin. The 4 women, as John mentioned, are Ita Ford and Maura Clark, both Maryknoll missioners, Dorothy Kazel, an Ursuline sister from Cleveland, and then Jean Donovan, a laywoman who was with the Cleveland mission team at the time that they were killed. I'd like to begin just by offering a little bit of the context. They were killed on December 2nd, 1980, and leading up to that time, a lot was happening in El Salvador and in the region. The Nicaraguan Revolution had occurred in 1979. This generated a lot of fear in some quarters, particularly here in the United States. The government was very concerned about the advance of communism through Central America and began to dedicate resources, even under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, to ensure the security of Central America, which was seen as part of U.S. national security. Another dimension of the picture is a long-standing oligarchy in El Salvador. So the so-called 14 families of El Salvador controlled 60% of the arable land and a vast majority of the capital of the country. So in a country of 5 million people, you have a very select group of elites controlling all of the resources, and this made for a lot of tension leading up to December 2nd, 1980. Peasants, campesinos, were beginning to advocate for their rights, and this wasn't taken well. So repression was heightened, and this was funded by largely by the U.S. government. You may know that Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated on March 24th of this same year. Jean Donovan had a practice during her time on the mission team of, when she could, of attending his masses and listening to his homilies, occasionally baking him cookies. And she was present also on March 30th, the day of his funeral, when 44 people were killed and hundreds more were wounded during the course of his funeral at the cathedral in San Salvador. In November of 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president. This was taken by the Salvadoran oligarchy and military as a kind of green light to continue the repression and to ramp it up. So during the course of the 12-year civil war in El Salvador, roughly from about 1980 to 1992, the U.S. provided about $6 billion in military and security aid, and that civil war resulted in the deaths of over 75,000 people and more than 1 million displaced people. Today, there are about 2 million Salvadorans living outside El Salvador, especially here in the United States. So these pictures, Ita Ford is here in the top left, and then, I should use this fancy pointer. No, that's the wrong one. This is why I don't use it. So this is Ita, and this is Maura Clark, and Dorothy Kazel, and Jean Donovan. So I'll say a little bit more about each of them as we go, but just here at the beginning, what happened on December 2nd? Maura and Ita had been attending a Maryknoll Sisters Regional Assembly in Nicaragua. They were returning to San Salvador on December 2nd. And Jean and Dorothy had agreed to go pick them up at the airport. And here's a little map. So here's where the Cleveland mission team was working in La Libertad. Dorothy and Jean were working there. Maura and Ita were working in Chalatenango with refugees in this area. And you see this Rio Sumpul along the border with Honduras. This was the site of a lot of persecution and massacres. As Salvadorans were trying to flee El Salvador and cross the river, soldiers would stand along the edge of the river and kill them very brutally. Here's the capital. This is where the airport is. So Dorothy and Jean went to pick them up at the airport, and earlier in the day they had already gone once to pick up two other sisters. For some reason their flight got delayed, and so Ita and Maura were coming in later. When Dorothy and Jean got to the airport that day the first time, the National Guard took note of them, and they made a phone call. Then when they returned again later in the day, those same soldiers alerted their superiors, and they got the word that they should follow the van of these women. So on the way back from the airport, their van was pulled over, and the four women were raped and murdered. And this is these are a couple of pictures of the shallow grave that was dug to hide their bodies. It took a couple of days for the embassy and the State Department to take action, mainly because the Salvadoran government and military were creating a lot of obstacles. So this is the scene where they uncovered the bodies from the shallow grave. There's a lot to say here as we go along. Robert White, the U.S. ambassador, actually had hosted Jean and Dorothy the night before, December 1st. Jean and Dorothy had stayed at the U.S. Embassy and had dinner with him. So he was very shocked to get word from the Cleveland mission team that they were missing. And he has said that he immediately had a sinking feeling that this didn't bode well, because when people went missing during this time, it usually meant that they had been killed. For her part, Ita, at the regional assembly of the sisters in Nicaragua, was asked to read words from Romero's last homily, and I have them here. Christ invites us not to fear persecution, because believe me, brothers and sisters, the one who is committed to the poor, bless you, must run the same fate as the poor. And in El Salvador, we know what the fate of the poor signifies: to disappear, be tortured, to be held captive, and to be found dead. And that phrase, the same fate as the poor from Romero, is the title of a book by Maryknoll sister Judith Noon about Maura and Ita and Carla Piet. I'll say more about Carla in just a minute. So I'd like to say just a little bit about each of the women, and also be sure to allow plenty of time for questions and comments. Dorothy Kazel, I mentioned, was an Ursuline sister, had taken part in interracial work and also ecumenical work while teaching in Cleveland, and then she joined the Cleveland mission team in 1974. This is a comment from her missionary colleague, Sister Martha Owen, just acknowledging the preferential option for the poor was in her heart even before we went. She felt the needs of the poor so deeply within herself that she identified with them. She was willing to sacrifice anything, and she offered herself for the violence to stop. This is a continuation of Martha Owen's reflections. What were they doing down there? They primarily went to exercise solidarity, very much in the spirit of Vatican II. When the Second Vatican Council ended, the Latin American bishops went home. They met in their own general congregation in 1968 at Medellin, Colombia, and they were asking, what does Vatican II mean in our countries? And one of the chief reflections and insights emerging from that was a commitment to the preferential option for the poor. And Gustavo Gutierrez, a Dominican priest on our own faculty, had a strong hand in advocating that way of understanding the meaning of the church's role in the world. So the Cleveland mission team was one of many missionary groups who understood their role, not just in El Salvador, but throughout Latin America, as trying to incarnate the Gospels and live out the fruits of the council. So they were engaging in education, so catechesis, teaching First Communion, liturgy of the Word sessions. The catechists that they trained were distributing communion, developing lay leadership. But then as things intensified through the 1970s, and civil war was erupting in the late 70s without really being named, these catechists were seen as the enemy. The enemy of whom? Well, the enemy of the landed elite who controlled all of the resources. An educated populace, an educated group of campesinos was not in their interest, and they exercised brutal repression to ensure their status quo. So catechists were labeled as enemies and communists, right? What's one way to get U.S. aid through this time especially? This is one of the hot spots of the Cold War. El Salvador and other places were surrogate battlefields for the Cold War unfolding between the Soviet Union and the United States. So a friend of ours at the Catholic Worker who lived with us for a year, I'll come back to her in a minute, but her name is Neres Gonzalez. She was one of these catechists. She worked with Rutilio Grande, who was assassinated as Romero became Archbishop in San Salvador in 1977. Why was he killed? He was killed for doing this, and he was accused of being a communist. Neres was one of his catechists, and Neres worked with coffee pickers, and she was teaching these coffee pickers how to read and write and read the scales. When they went to bring their coffee beans to be weighed, Neres was helping them realize that they were being cheated. And you can imagine that the coffee growers weren't too thrilled to be paying more per pound. Neres was detained and tortured. She was 8 months pregnant at the time, and they made a point of brutalizing her so that she lost her baby. And I'll come back to her a little bit later. That's not the end of her story. She eventually came up here as a political asylee after the peace accords in El Salvador for environmental work that she was doing. But I bring her up because she's representative of the people with whom the Churchwomen were working. So this is Dorothy Kazel's world here, reflected through her friend Martha Owen. There was a disconnect totally between a better economic situation and being committed to the poor. Faith does have consequences in the real world. So in light of our theme of these lectures, Saturday with the Saints during the Year of Faith, here's a very poignant interpretation of what faith looks like in the face of this disconnect between people who have everything materially and people whose lives are on the line day in and day out. And by the way, all the people we're talking about, the vast majority of Salvadorans through this time were Roman Catholic. Right? So Dorothy and Jean's work in La Libertad, Sheila Toby, an Ursuline sister, visited shortly before the women were killed, and this was her reflection shortly afterwards. What were they doing? So in working with refugees, securing food and medical supplies, finding shelter for them, taking the sick and wounded to medical clinics. They were unable to take the wounded to government-sponsored, sorry, there should be a hyphen there, hospitals for fear that these innocent victims would be killed right there in the hospital. And in the process of these duties, they fell in love with the beauty and the warmth of the Salvadoran people. Dorothy, writing the month before she was killed to a friend about the situation in El Salvador, recognizing that El Salvador is writhing in pain, a country that daily faces the loss of so many of its people, and yet a country that is waiting, hoping, yearning for peace. The steadfast faith and courage of our leaders have to continue preaching the word of the Lord, even though it may mean laying down your life in the very real sense, is always a point of admiration and a vivid realization that Jesus is here with us. Yes, we have a sense of waiting, hoping, and yearning for a complete realization of the kingdom, and yet we know it will come because we can celebrate him here right now. They were killed during Advent. I'll come back to that at the very end. But that sense of waiting and hoping and expectancy, and yet in the midst of recognizing the real presence of Jesus here with us, especially in the suffering and persecution of the most vulnerable. Where is Jesus present? Jesus is present in the hearts of everyone, but especially those who are suffering in the face of great persecution. And many of these people were persecuted precisely because of the work they were doing, the catechetical work, the sacramental preparation work that they were doing, because the church was shifting its stance. For many, many decades, the Salvadoran church was aligned with the oligarchy, was aligned with the elites. And through this time, especially following Vatican II, it had shifted its stance because of that vision of Vatican II and the Latin American bishops of trying to embrace the preferential option for the poor. Not in an exclusive way. I think that's an important point. The option for the poor never means to the exclusion of anyone. I think of it rather as the practice of a large family. If one child is very sick, everyone, the rest of the family, does what they can to support that child out of love, right? That's where love and energy most need to be focused. And so the landed elite perceived the activity of those inspired by the preferential option for the poor to be directed against them. And that was really never the case. Romero tried over and over to make that point. It was the case, though, that they were being asked to redistribute their wealth in the name of justice and service of the common good. And to the extent that people identify material things as part of their very identities, to that extent, the exercise of the preferential option for the poor can be very threatening. And so that's what was happening here. But Romero and others were trying to say, no, this is a path of freedom, real interior freedom for you, because human dignity is at stake. And who are you becoming if you're involved in the death and persecution of your brothers and sisters in Christ? So the Churchwomen were following in Romero's footsteps. Dorothy Kazel, writing to a friend, each of them, the four of them, as you'll see, had some sense that their lives were on the line simply by remaining in El Salvador in this climate. So she wrote to a friend that October. We talked a bit today about what happens if something begins. Most of us feel we would want to stay here. We wouldn't want to just run out on the people. I thought I should say this to you because I don't want to say it to anyone else, because I don't think they would understand. Anyway, my beloved friend, just know that how I feel and treasure it in your heart. If a day comes when others will have to understand, please explain it for me. So Dorothy was working with Jean. Jean, born in 1953, was the youngest of the four churchwomen from Westport, Connecticut, but settled in Cleveland. I smile because she was a real firecracker. It was said that she was known to pour scotch on her cereal one morning. She loved to party. She rode her motorcycle. She was trained as an accountant with an MBA from Case Western. She was also engaged to be married to a physician, Doug Cable. But as she discerned what to do, it was one of those choices that maybe each of you might be able to identify with. There is something in your life that you can't not do. And I think joining the Cleveland mission team fit that category for Jean. She said of that decision, I want to get closer to him, and that's the only way I think I can. And she reflected in letters to friends how difficult this was. You know, she said, I'm 26 years old, I should be married. I sit there and talk to God and say, why are you doing this to me? It sounds like Jonah, sort of. Why can't I just be your little suburban housewife? And he hasn't answered yet. And she wrote after Romero's death, I think that the hardship one endures maybe is God's way of taking you out into the desert and to prepare you to meet and love him more fully. There's no doubt that her experience on the Cleveland mission team was a desert experience. In the midst of all of the pain, I think she was a person of great joy. She played the guitar and she was beloved by the children there. But interiorly, this was a desert experience for her. She wrote to a friend in Connecticut before she was killed, shortly before she was killed, that several times I have decided to leave El Salvador, and I almost could, except for the children, the poor bruised victims of this insanity. Who would care for them? Whose heart would be so staunch as to favor the reasonable thing in a sea of their tears and helplessness? Not mine, dear friend, not mine. You know, this invocation of reason is interesting because when you really see what was going on in El Salvador and throughout Central America and in other places in Latin America where there was such strong repression and really a sense of the demonic at work. Mara Clark, I didn't include it here, but she wrote to a friend, when you see the brutalization, bodies being dumped on the side of the road and people being prohibited from burying those bodies, there was a strong sense of the demonic, and there was no reason. It's completely irrational, the level of hatred and violence. So here she is trying to describe her sense of why she needs to stay, that from the other angle, from the perspective of people at home, it doesn't make sense, because here's a young woman of great privilege who could have gotten on a plane any moment, but she needed to stay, just as she had needed to go to El Salvador. She needed to stay because that was where she was finding God. She was in relationship with God through the love that she shared with the people with whom she was working. Ida Ford had, as a missionary, a Maryknoll missioner from Brooklyn, New York, arrived in Chile to work there shortly before the coup on September 11th, 1973. And I'll just say I was a lay associate with the Holy Cross Fathers in Santiago, Chile during the last years of Pinochet, so the other end of the dictatorship from 87 to 89. And I went to Chile largely through the inspiration of these women who were killed when I was in high school. But their witness was so powerful. And I say that because I know that I'm not alone in that. A whole generation of young Catholics in this country were conscientized by the witness of these women. So Ida spent a good part of the 70s in Chile dealing with the effects of the dictatorship, another brutal dictatorship where more than 3,000 people were disappeared, many, many more were detained and tortured. And in the midst of that, she reflected and wrote quite a bit, and some of those reflections are in this book, The Same Fate as the Poor. And this is one of them. Am I willing to suffer with the people here, the suffering of the powerless, the feeling impotent? Can I say to my neighbors, I have no solutions to this situation. I don't know the answers, but I will walk with you, search with you, be with you. Can I let myself be evangelized by this opportunity? Can I look at and accept my own poorness as I learn it from the poor ones? And I think in all of these, their reflections for each of these four women, that's a very common thread that I notice at least, and I offer it to you today, that they were just ordinary folks and dealing with a lot of fear, struggling to remain faithful, wondering if this is really what God was asking, and so humble. They were learning from the people with whom they were ministering. How can I be poor with these people who are poor and yet so rich? People who have nothing, who don't have a choice to stay or to go. They have to stay. Bless you. Each of the four women faced this crucible of wondering what they should do, and yet decided to remain because that's where they experience God's love. And that is the love that overcomes fear. Ida and her friend Carla left Chile to go to El Salvador precisely in response to Archbishop Romero's plea for help. So that plea went out to the whole church, and the Maryknollers, among others, really attended to that and discerned. And Ida and Carla discerned that they would go to El Salvador. They happened to be traveling en route when he was assassinated on March 24th of that year. In June, they began working in Chalatenango. I showed you on the map. It's toward Honduras and the northern part of El Salvador. And they were working with the Emergency Refugee Committee there. And they wrote to the president of their order, Melinda Roper, since the death of Monsignor Romero, the news coverage on Salvador has declined to almost nothing. The committee fears that decisive action will be taken by our government, the US government, under the guise of stopping communism, and that all of Central America will be involved if it happens. It's a heavy scene, but if we have a preferential option for the poor, as well as a commitment for justice as a basis for the coming of the kingdom, we're going to have to take sides in El Salvador. Correction, we have. So they're talking about taking sides. Again, they didn't mean this to the exclusion of anyone, but rather to invite the landed elites to recognize that for their own sakes, for their own dignity, they needed to be on the side of solidarity, of protecting human dignity. On August 23rd, Ita and Carla had just picked up a political prisoner who had been released, and they were taking him home. There was a flash flood, and as their vehicle crossed a river, it was swept away. And Carla managed to push Ita out of the vehicle, and Ita was able to grab a branch and crawl to safety. And then the next day, they found Carla's body. So that was just shortly before Ita herself would die. But in the meantime, Ita recalled that Carla had just written a letter to a friend saying, I do feel, and today I can say, now I have a heart of flesh. And Ita said, you're right, we do have hearts of flesh now. The Salvadoran people have converted us. So it's that there's a sense of God's love shining through. You know, the line from Lumen Fide, the document starts with John 12:46, a light that shines in darkness. And John made reference to that at the beginning. I think that these four women are seen as lights, but they saw the Salvadoran people as lights of Christ's love in the midst of such darkness. And then August, so shortly before Carla died in that flash flood, Ita had written to her niece in New York on her niece's birthday. And it's such a moving letter. She was, in the letter, she talks about working with children, with teenagers, and the pain of finding their bodies. You know, kids that are getting active in the church community, and there's no reason why they were killed, but they would just be picked up and found dead. And so she's writing to her niece to offer her niece words of encouragement and recognizing the distinction between the context in El Salvador and then what her niece was living in New York, but looking for this thread of commonality. The reasons why so many people are being killed are quite complicated, yet there are some clear, simple strands. One is that many people have found a meaning to live, to sacrifice, struggle, and even die. What I'm saying is that I hope you can come to find that which gives life a deep meaning for you, something that energizes you, enthuses you, enables you to move ahead. So she's going through a very intense time of discernment herself about her own commitments in El Salvador. But she's trying to accompany people whose lives are on the line every day, and she's reaching out to her niece, who doesn't share that context at all, and trying to encourage her niece to really go deeper in taking responsibility for her own life and noticing how God is moving in that life, right? Something that energizes you, enthuses you, enables you to move ahead. Where is God in that vocational discernment, right? All of them were trying to stay in touch with people in the U.S. to conscientize. So earlier we saw that slide about the effort of Dorothy and the Ursulines to try to conscientize people in El Salvador, but there's a reverse dynamic, the importance, the urgency really of trying to conscientize people in the United States, make them aware of what was going on in El Salvador and the fact that the US government was funding this. Maura Clark, also from New York, Maryknoll missioner who was sent with Maryknoll to Nicaragua in 1959 and spent most of her life, most of her ministry there in Nicaragua. And she was there through the earthquake in 1972, devastating earthquake. After Carla died, Maura went to El Salvador to work with Ita and was in the process of discerning whether she would remain there. And of the work that she was doing through that time, this is what she wrote. We have the refugees, women and children outside our door. Some of their stories are incredible. What's happening here is so impossible but happening. The endurance of the poor and their faith through this terrible pain is constantly pulling me to a deeper faith response. So there's this mutual dynamic of ministry going on, right? A mutual witness of faith. The faith of the people enduring such persecution, and then the invitation that she experiences from God to deepen her own faith in the midst of that. And working with women and children, this is a context in which the Salvadoran military are going village by village and picking up males. And what happens? The families are left behind, no source of income, very vulnerable. And this is part of the tremendous refugee crisis in a country with no resources. Suddenly you have all of these displaced people trying to find safety for their families. And she too deals with that very human fear of death. My fear of death is being challenged constantly as children, lovely young girls, old people are being shot, cut up with machetes, bodies thrown by the road, people prohibited from burying them. A loving father must have a new life of unimaginable joy and peace prepared for these precious, unknown, uncelebrated martyrs. So that sense that we saw earlier of the already but not yet quality of God's reign, she's experiencing that right in the midst of unimaginable suffering and looking for that joy and peace, holding with certainty that promise of joy and peace. One cries out, Lord, how long? And then two, what creeps into my mind is the little fear or big that when it touches me very personally, will I be faithful? So it was at that General Assembly in Nicaragua where Ita and Maura were traveling from when they came back on December 2nd, that Maura affirmed before all of the Marinollers gathered there that she wanted to remain in El Salvador. I want to stay on now. I believe now that this is right. Here I am starting from scratch, but it must be his plan, and he is teaching me that there's real peace in spite of many frustrations and the terror around us and the work, etc. God is very present in his seeming absence. So that sense of, Skillebeck talks about that sense of luminosity in the midst of the darkness. It's also, I think of John of the Cross as well. Looking for being able to perceive God's presence precisely because of the darkness in that moment. I think she had a very keen sense of that. San Pedro Nonualco, the site where they recovered the women's bodies, if many here have probably visited that site. Anybody travel to this site? Okay. Well, I thought I had heard you say you did. There's a chapel there now, and on the anniversary of the women's deaths, there's a gathering there every year on around that date of December 2nd. This is a gathering of people from Philadelphia. So I was able to go there for the 20th anniversary of the Churchwomen's death, and I don't have words really to describe the feeling of being in this courtyard. There's a monument to the women. They're actually buried elsewhere. But their presence, their life is so palpable. There were more than 500 people gathered, and most of them were women. Most of them were women who have worked there for much of their adult lives in ministry in Latin America. And there was such an affirmation of life, of a yes to life there, that I carry that with me to this day when I see this picture. I also think it's important to remember with Sister Sheila Toby this reflection, that sense of reverse mission that is still so necessary for U.S. Americans. To pilgrimage with visitors from North America to the sites of the martyrs were grace moments for me, yet I find myself wondering sometimes if we dishonor our martyrs by putting them way up on a pedestal, seeing them as larger than life. Is that the way we distance ourselves from the reality of their choices, thus insulating ourselves from the demands of living the works of mercy in the spirit of the Beatitudes in our own circumstances? What I remember most about Dorothy and Jean is how very much they were just part of the gang, very ordinary, with all the same fears and hopes, anxieties and dreams as all their friends. It's that very normal humanity that painfully challenges us as we live a lifestyle of comfort and security, well established by our privileged place in the world economy. It's something for us to discern. Sitting here on a football Saturday, I'm very aware of that. I think, oh, wait, this is kind of surreal. And yet, I think about the four churchwomen. They would be saying, go Irish. They would be so happy that we're gathered and that we're remembering the people of El Salvador, and would be asking us to take responsibility as citizens of the United States for the good of everyone, not just our own people, but to see all people as made in God's image and sources of Jesus Christ's light in the world. So a little bit further in the story, General Carlos Vides Casanova was one of the generals who held command responsibility over the National Guard when the churchwomen were killed, the unit that killed them, as well as the unit that was responsible for torturing Neris Gonzalez. So General Casanova, after retiring, moved to Florida and received great praise from the U.S. government. He was defense minister under President Dorothy, who, by the way, is a Notre Dame grad. July 2002, Casanova and Garcia were found guilty in U.S. court of torture and ordered to pay $54.6 million, which they haven't paid, by the way, to Neris and two others who brought suit, Juan Romagosa and Carlos Mauricio. I should say, too, Ita Ford's brother, Bill Ford, for the rest of his life, he died in 2008, spent his life trying to ascertain the truth of what happened to the churchwomen and bringing perpetrators to justice. So I think of him when I think of the recent happenings, that Casanova was ordered by an immigration judge to be deported from Florida on evidence of his assistance in the killings of the churchwomen and additional cases of torture. It's worth noting, though, that Vides Casanova's defense includes the claim that he acted with the knowledge and approval of the U.S. government and in accord with U.S. policy. And it's hard to argue with that. That's absolutely true. He had a green light for what he was doing. I should say Jean's father was a design engineer working on the Sikorsky helicopter that was used in El Salvador. Jean and her family were staunch Republicans, her family, until all of this happened. And they realized that the U.S. government was obfuscating the truth, creating obstacles for them, and as they tried to find out what happened to their daughter, they received a bill of $3,500 from the State Department for the transport of Jean's body back to the United States. So it's a very, very painful reality that the generals received a warm welcome and a good life in Florida, and the families of the churchwomen were stonewalled. So this is a mural in El Salvador. As I mentioned, I feel like they're present with us here. They're certainly present where they're ministering in El Salvador. The first two figures there, I can use my little pointer here. Romero is here, and this is one of the martyred priests in El Salvador under Romero's episcopacy, Father Ortiz. And let me just go back to the very beginning to say a little bit about that icon. I held off. So this is by Lewis Williams, and he talks about the significance of the icon. It's an Advent wreath, since they were killed in Advent. Dorothy Kazel is the third week, the pink ribbon of joy. Dorothy said at one point she wanted to be an alleluia from head to toe. And she was known as that sort of joyful, ebullient person. Here, he wanted to represent the beautiful view of the mountains from the site where their bodies were recovered. And you can sort of, from this distance, it may be hard to see, but there's barbed wire along here. He wanted to represent the fraught and contested experience of division of material resources in El Salvador. So the landed elite versus everyone else. The barbed wire represents that. And this is a cross. It says Carla on it. This is much like the cross used every November, around November 16th, the vigil in Fort Benning, Georgia, to close the School of the Americas, which it's no longer called that. It's called the Western Hemispheric Institute for Security and Cooperation. But people who gather there still call it the School of the Americas. This is the school run by the U.S. Army where the units who were responsible for the Churchwomen's death, the Archbishop Romero's death, and the assassination of the Jesuits and their housekeeper and her daughter in 1989 were all trained with U.S. taxpayer dollars. So thousands of people have gathered since 1989 when the Jesuits were killed, holding crosses like this. So he wanted to represent that. Okay, I think I better stop there. Thanks for listening. One other little personal note, and then I really want to see what reflections you all have. I worked with Father Paul Schindler when I came back from Chile. I did pastoral work in Akron, Ohio, at St. Bernard's Church, where Paul Schindler was pastor. And Paul was head of the Cleveland mission team when the women were killed and identified their bodies. And he also, in his ministry, took pictures of all the bodies that were left by the roadside as a way to document what was happening. Paul, so I was there in the parish in Ohio from 90 to 92, and Paul couldn't sleep. One year he did 164 weddings. So think about that. It's at least 4 weddings every Saturday. He was dealing with the trauma of what he had witnessed. I saw him after the trial of the generals, where he was able to give testimony and share those photos that he had taken all those years. And he was so at peace. He said after the trial he was finally able to rest because he was able to speak the truth finally and face the people who were significantly responsible for all of that carnage. And he retired and he's back in El Salvador. He always wanted to go back to El Salvador to retire. Thoughts or insights or your own experiences? Please. Can't quite see it. Sorry about the podium.
Where was liberation theology during this time after Vatican II? There was talk of that, and then it just seemed to be a slogan and it disappeared. Where was the church with that?
Yeah, well, that was part of the struggle at the time. So liberation theology, following Medellin in 1968, church workers throughout Latin America were trying to live out what they took from Vatican II or what they were taking from the Latin American bishops' documents. And liberation, Gustavo Gutierrez published his book in 1971, A Theology of Liberation. Many other theologians were writing. There were many different strands of liberation theology. And what was going on in El Salvador was tied up with various interpretations of liberation theology. When Romero became archbishop in 1977 in San Salvador, he talked with Rutilio Grande, his good friend, Jesuit pastor of Aguilares, and said, I'm a little concerned about what I see here in terms of expressions of liberation theology. And Rutilio Grande said to him, we're doing catechesis by the book. What's happening is these campesinos are being pushed and pulled by various strands of Marxist ideology. People inspired by Marxist ideology were advocating for land reform, for human rights. So were Rutilio Grande's parishioners. And they were beginning to work together. And the lines were becoming very blurred. But the oligarchy had an interest in painting the picture so that it was all the church's fault. The church was training these Marxist guerrillas. And that was not the case. It's true that some church workers did leave their ministry and join the guerrillas. So our friend Neres, who lived at our Catholic Worker for a year, after she was tortured and lost her baby, was released and joined the guerrillas. And if you talk with her about that, in her mind, she never gave up her faith, but it was a question, she perceived it as a question of life and death for her people, and that they needed to defend themselves. They didn't see themselves, all of them didn't see themselves as committed to Marxist ideology, but they needed to practice self-defense. That's how she puts it. Romero, after Grande was killed on his way back from performing baptisms, shortly after Romero became Archbishop, about 2 weeks afterwards, Grande was assassinated, and he began to take a more public and forceful position against the violence. And he too was painted as a Marxist, which is extremely ironic because Romero was, if anything, more traditionalist throughout his life, and had raised concerns himself about liberation theology. I would want to say that if you would ask Gustavo Gutierrez, he would be one of the first to tell you that he did not endorse use of violence or alliance with Marxist ideology as part of liberation theology. But there were many interpreters of liberation theology active at the time. Through the mid-'80s, the Vatican engaged in conversations with liberation theologians. There's a volume of Gustavo's called The Truth Shall Make You Free, which is a collection of his exchanges with officials from the Vatican about his theology. There were 2 documents issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1984 and 1986, attempting to sift out the various strands of liberation theology doctrinally. Thereafter, there was a kind of cooling effect throughout Latin America generally. You know, you can find places where a certain bishop was very supportive and pastoral workers there were still engaging in base communities. But for the most part, liberation theology was not encouraged after that point, generally speaking. So there's a lot more to say about that. Bob?
Yeah, didn't Romero go to Rome and meet with the Pope shortly before he died?
Yeah.
And then later on, the Pope visits El Salvador and he's weeping at his grave. Does anybody know what actually happened at the meeting?
Well, a friend of Romero's has said that at the meeting, Romero brought pictures of people who had been detained and tortured, and also people who were taken and never seen again. And he tried to share them with John Paul II, and the Pope responded and held his hands like this, and state and church, you must go back and negotiate with the government. And didn't look at the photos that Romero had brought. And Romero said in response, well, Your Holiness, it's the government that is largely responsible for what you see here. And the Pope said, you must go back and negotiate with the government. And I believe from my own research and study that John Paul II was not getting accurate information from the nuncio and others in El Salvador, who did not like Romero, did not like what Romero was trying to do. And they, in fact, were going behind Romero's back to the Vatican, advocating that the Vatican appoint an administrator to take Romero's place. So when Romero was assassinated, I really think that John Paul II was shocked by that. He didn't see it coming, and probably realized that the information he had gotten was not the full truth. And actually, he became one of the strongest advocates of Romero's canonization process. So I was in El Salvador the day that it was announced that the Pope had died. And it was right before the public mass of all those gathered for Romero's anniversary, the anniversary of his death. And a radio station reporter happened to pull up right next to me and asked me what I thought about the Pope's death. And I said, you know, I have this picture of Romero and John Paul II in heaven, enjoying the joy of reconciliation, that now they both know the fullness of truth. And I still have that image. So now under Pope Francis, Romero's canonization process has been officially unblocked. So I think we'll see some movement soon. But you know, in El Salvador, he's already a saint, so it's just a matter of Rome catching up a little bit. So. Any other?
How did the Maryknoll missions deal with their murders? What happened afterwards?
Well, you know, the Maryknolls and the Ursulines and the Cleveland mission team all were very shocked and rocked by what happened, but they remained in El Salvador and they remained committed, and more people were sent. They made a point of trying to do reverse education, reverse mission here in the United States to conscientize people here about what was going on. And, you know, the State Department, the incoming cabinet members of Ronald Reagan, Jean Kirkpatrick and Alexander Haig, made many public comments trying to paint the women as communists. Haig said that there seemed to be some suggestion that the women tried to run a roadblock in their white church van, which, you know, after seeing this, it's ridiculous. But there was this awareness that a lot of work needed to happen in the United States in order for the public here to realize the consequences of understanding U.S. security in such brutal terms, that there was no limit to disregard for Salvadoran life and dignity in the name of U.S. security. So Maryknoll, in particular, worked for that evangelization process, if you will.
You started talking about those 14 families.
Yeah.
And after all that country went through, and after the witness of so many martyrs, what is it like there today? Has wealth been redistributed?
No. The short answer is no. There were peace accords. In 1992, there was the signing of peace agreements. But I mentioned my friend Neris. So the rest of her story, the way she ended up as a political asylee in the United States, was after the peace accords. She was working with youth to reforest a hillside that had been bombed during the war. They planted 2,000 saplings, and then the next day the Salvadoran Air Force bombed that hillside because they had named it Forest of Reconciliation Monsignor Romero, and the Salvadoran Air Force said that that was a subversive act, and this is after the peace accords in the mid-90s. So her life was in danger because of the ecological work that she was doing with youth. According to the peace accords, some land was redistributed, but it was very minimal, and what happened was, through the course of the war, with all of the refugees, Salvadoran gangs started developing. So a lot of Salvadoran young men ended up growing up in places like Los Angeles, and the Mara Chucha is one of the gangs. They were exporting gang members back to El Salvador. So that this is El Salvador now is one of the places of high gang violence in the whole world for a country so small. And because there were so many Salvadoran refugees, the main source of income now for El Salvador actually is remittances. So money sent back from family members in places like the United States to El Salvador. It's estimated to be over $2 billion. The economy is struggling. People have to commute from rural areas into the city, and so it isn't really a question of access to land anymore because the economy has become more industrial, and yet people might have to commute 2 hours each way to get to a job in the city. The 14 families now are the 8 families, and they've shifted from land as their source of capital to telecommunications. That's what drives them. And El Salvador, meanwhile, has adopted the US dollar as its currency, the dollarization of the economy. So it's been the war has continued in many ways for the people of El Salvador. Well, John, are we at time?
We have time for maybe one more quick question.
Was there someone over here? You had.
Is the church where this community from Philadelphia came to visit?
Yeah.
It looked like there was one other woman on the left. Is it the one
Oh yeah. Here, the one on the far left is Carla Piet, Ida's friend. So, as in the icon, because Ita and Carla had worked together so closely, and Maura went to El Salvador to replace Carla, she's often included with the four women. Yeah.
So friends, we've come to the end of the hour, and maybe we can take that opportunity to thank our speaker again.